And we are complete, Mr. Prorector.
Thank you so much. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Adriana Caballero Pérez will defend the academic thesis entitled Voting Matters, an analysis of the use of electoral-assistive devices through the lens of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Dear candidate, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. I will share my screen now. Thank you, dear Prorector and dear members of the degree committee. It is an honor to present you today my research findings. In my research work, I argued that an inclusive democratic system involves more than formal equality of all voters. It entails adopting measures to achieve equality in practice. And these measures include providing voting technological solutions to be used by persons with disabilities. These technological solutions can significantly remove inaccessible conditions for persons with disabilities. I would like to start my presentation by saying that in his first television interview in 1961, Nelson Mandela talked about the cornerstone of a truly democratic and free society: one person, one vote. The fight for an equal vote has been a long one for different marginalized populations, including persons with disabilities. And research shows that Europe is no exception in this regard. Drawing on two case studies conducted in England and Spain, I explore the de facto realization of the right to vote by persons with disabilities, or the opportunity to enjoy this right on an equal basis with others. And I was particularly interested in investigating the connection between the right of persons with disabilities to vote secretly and independently and their use of voting technological solutions, mainly technologies known as electoral-assistive devices. In this context, I addressed two main research questions. Under international law, what legal obligations do state parties have to make electoral-assistive devices available for use by persons with disabilities, and how do practices within electoral systems in England and Spain constrain or support the use of these devices? So first, what is assistive technology? Desmond and others define assistive technology as the development and application of scientific knowledge, skills, and policies relevant to the provision of assistive devices. And assistive devices are usually defined as any item, piece of equipment, or product system that is used to improve individuals' functional performance. For example, a walker is a personal assistive device. In the context of voting, a range of electoral-assistive devices already exist to assist voters with disabilities when voting. And this leads us to the first set of findings arising from my study, a non-exhaustive inventory of available and emerging electoral-assistive devices. So I used a scoping literature review to carry out this comprehensive inventory. I was able to identify a range of haptic or tactile, reading, writing, visual, electronic voting, and other communication technological aids. I found that different countries, both within and outside Europe, already provide voters with disabilities with these devices. I also found that there is a move towards targeting multiple audience groups of voters. This means not only persons with disabilities. And indeed, several countries are using assistive technology as an option to make voting materials more accessible to all voters. My most surprising finding related to the inventory was that available electoral-assistive devices range from low-tech to high-tech devices and systems. This means that states can make mechanical and affordable devices available, as well as power-dependent and expensive devices to be used by voters with disabilities. And this is an important finding, given that assistive technology might be inaccurately considered to always be costly, but my research demonstrated that many available devices are reasonably priced. I also discussed that the use of electoral-assisted devices involves, among others, procurement and security challenges. States must, of course, address these challenges through assistive technology policy programs to advance assistive technology availability in elections. After doing this inventory, I proceeded to establish the legal basis for providing these devices. I applied the rules and principles of treaty interpretation to relevant provisions of international human rights law addressing voting rights, and primarily Article 29A of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. Now, the CRPD endorses a very progressive understanding of disability. Article 29A CRPD applied the right to vote provided by other international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in a manner that addresses the particular needs of persons with disabilities. Article 29A CRPD goes beyond a formal recognition of equality to address barriers to participation encountered by voters with disabilities, as well as to provide them with equal opportunities to vote. Now, under this provision, states parties must provide, among others, accessible voting materials, protect the secrecy of the ballot, and guarantee the free expression of the will of persons with disabilities as voters. To comply with these obligations, states must adopt positive measures where necessary to uphold the principles of equality and non-discrimination in the context of voting. And these measures include making assistive and new technologies available for achieving greater accessibility of the voting environment, and other equality measures, such as making reasonable accommodations to individual voters. All these measures aim to render participation in elections realizable for voters with disabilities. And in that regard, the CRPD leaves the states parties discretion, noteworthy creating opportunities for achieving de facto equality is not entirely a cost-free obligation. Relevant positive measures require public funding and policy planning for their implementation. Moreover, states must be effective in achieving outcomes consistent with the obligations of the CRPD. And these ideas bring us to the last set of findings of my study, the analysis of compliance with Article 29A CRPD by England and Spain through law, policy, and in practice, with the latter research based on the experiences of research participants in voting. And this research was done through semi-structured interviews with persons with disabilities and election officials. First, to explore the practices taking place within the national electoral systems that support or constrain the voting experience of the research participants with disabilities, we must define the term practices. This term commonly refers to everyday actions. Now, the concept of practices adopted in my research is from social practice theories, and particularly Anthony Giddens. In a nutshell, Giddens centers the analysis of practices on the agency-structure relationship. Agency refers to human action, more specifically to the actor's capability of doing things in the first place, such as voting. And structures include people's understandings and or assumptions about disability, as well as their knowledge on voting rights, for example. Technology is part of people's structures. It is a resource that people might reflexively use to act. And Giddens proposes that just as an individual's autonomy is influenced by the structures are also maintained and adapted through the exercise of agency. And in this process, the reciprocal interaction between actors and structures shape practices taking place within the national electoral systems, for example. Now let's talk about these practices. I will broadly summarize here the findings from the two case studies. First, in the two countries, I found that in most cases, it was participants' strength and individual efforts that were put in place to overcome accessibility barriers. These efforts include going to vote with a companion, remembering all candidates' names, and the order in which they are listed on the official ballot paper, and using personal assistive devices. These personal assistive devices are out-of-pocket costs, of course. Other voters were not subject to similar measures. In the two countries, I also found relevant national legislation providing for the jure and de facto equal voting rights for all persons with disabilities. And another good practice to remove inaccessible conditions for voters with disabilities, and mainly those with visual impairments who know Braille, is providing them with haptic or tactile and visual aids that are working and properly maintained. And there are also relevant policy initiatives, including some voter education publications. Now, conversely, voting experiences of some research participants were constrained by other practices, mainly by non-compliance with relevant national legislation by national electoral authorities. There are inaccessible voting materials in the two countries that reflect the dominant able-bodied approach to voting, and that are actually related to lack of action on many issues, including absence of accessibility standards applicable to voting materials and meaningful consultations with persons with disabilities, as well as absence of voter education initiatives targeted at persons with disabilities, and training of election officials on voting rights of persons with disabilities. And in general, there is a failure to consider human diversity and voters' demographics as relevant perspectives to design and implement accessible voting materials. Moreover, in these two countries, there are no mechanisms to examine the application of the existing devices or technology partnerships between assistive technology vendors and national electoral authorities to ensure the development of new voting technological solutions. And lastly, I found that the digital divide was a discriminatory barrier to enjoy the right to make an informed political choice by some participants, and mainly those living in rural areas. Finally, the key conclusions to my research are the following. The interpretation of Article 29A CRPD and related provisions in this study confirmed that under the CRPD, the immediately realizable or negative obligation to respect the right to vote is reinforced by the progressively realizable or positive obligation to provide accessibility in the voting environment, so that persons with disabilities can vote on an equal basis with others. Anthony Giddens' definition of social practices explained that the implementation of Article 29A CRPD can be enhanced or constrained not only by domestic legislation and policy instruments, but also by actions of relevant actors, including poll workers. Moreover, my study provided evidence that the provision of electoral-assistive devices throughout the electoral process is a positive measure for achieving de facto equality. This is a substantive positive measure for achieving greater accessibility in the voting environment, protecting the ballot secrecy, and guaranteeing the free expression of the will of persons with disabilities as voters, as required by the CRPD. This study also confirmed that the development and implementation of assistive technology in elections requires a comprehensive framework of analysis. Multiple actors must be involved in conducting this analysis. This includes assistive technology designers and national electoral authorities, but is not limited to them. Substantial benefit for voters with disabilities from using electoral assistive devices to vote must be determined by persons with disabilities themselves. I hope that my research persuades regional and local policymakers to provide and support investment, research, and the production of new voting technological solutions to ensure that persons with disabilities can vote on an equal basis with others. And with this, I thank you for listening, and I look forward to the questions of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Komans. Professor Komans is Emeritus Professor of Human Rights and Peace at our university, and he's also the chair of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Rector. Dear Mrs. Candidate, let me start by congratulating you on this solid piece of work. It is well written, accessible, and well structured. You have done extensive research into many dimensions of the right to vote for persons with disabilities. Well done, and appreciation is very much deserved. However, it is not my role today to shower you with compliments, but to discuss with you some issues which have given rise to questions and debate. I want to raise a question about the research methodology, in particular, the method of treaty interpretation. In your study, you apply the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, in particular, Article 31. After discussing the different approaches to treaty interpretation, you state on page 114 of your study that a dynamic interpretation has been adopted to provide an accurate interpretation and understanding of the meaning of the rights included in the human rights treaties based on the three major principles of treaty interpretation. On page 133, you argue that this interpretation determines the normative nature of the legal obligations of states parties under Article 29A of the CRPD. It can be argued that your interpretation of the relevant treaty provisions is based on an expansive and progressive interpretation of the law. I was wondering to what extent your interpretation should be characterized as lex lata and/or lex ferenda. Is it descriptive of the law as it exists today, or also an interpretation of the law as it should be? In this regard, it is important to mention that in your research, you use many recommendations adopted by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, such as general comments and concluding observations. You justified this by referring to Article 31, Section 3b of the Vienna Convention, which mentions, and I quote, any subsequent practice in the application of the treaty which establishes the agreement of the parties regarding its interpretation, unquote. Applying the decisions and recommendations of the treaty body as a legal basis may be risky, because state parties have never been asked whether they agree with such an interpretation. Some United Nations treaty bodies have even been accused of so-called lawmaking in their general comments, without having the explicit democratic legitimation of states. I'm asking this because your expansive and progressive interpretation of obligations of state parties has consequences for the implementation of those obligations. Many states, in particular those in the global south, will not have the means and resources to give effect to these obligations as interpreted by you. In other words, is your understanding of the obligations realistic when it comes to their implementation in resource-poor countries? You only refer to a process of removing existing barriers gradually, yet steadily, on page 144. But does this take into account the situation in a country such as Cambodia or the Congo, where probably other priorities will be chosen for allocating scarce financial resources. Referring to the need for international cooperation in this regard on page 145 sounds rather free of obligations. Could you enlighten me on the different questions I've raised? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question. Yes, in my research, as I comprehensively explained in the introductory chapter to the book, and particularly in chapter 3, I applied the rules and principles of treaty interpretation articles 31 and 32 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties to relevant provisions of international human rights treaties addressing voting rights, and primarily Article 29A CRPD. I also, when I say that I apply the principles of treaty interpretation, I mean by that the use of the principle of effective and evolutive and autonomous interpretation. And I also remember that I noted in chapter 3 that using or applying the rules and principles of treaty interpretation is, of course, not an easy task, and the result may be subject, it is always subject actually to interpretation by other experts and by the reader themselves. Now, I, of course, base part of my analysis of mainly Article 29A CRPD on the elaborations by the CRPD committee. And I, of course, understand that these, for example, the general comments, the concluding observations, and even the decisions adopted by the CRPD committee in reviewing some individual communications are not legally binding instruments per se, but it is how we in international human rights law have understood that the elaborations by the UN treaty-based bodies are, of course, authoritative sources of interpretation. So it was useful for me to use these elaborations by the CRPD committee. I also even use some human rights indicators, qualitative indicators developed by the UN Office of the High Commissioner, just as a relevant point of reference, right? Now, the second part of your question addressing whether or not I took into account, or if my interpretation is very progressive and if I didn't take into account, let's say, the financial, mainly, implications of ensuring accessibility in the voting environment. I think that this idea gives me here the opportunity to elaborate on two key legal obligations of states parties under the CRPD. One, and the differences between these two main obligations. I am referring to the obligation to make reasonable accommodations and the obligation to provide accessibility of the voting environment under the relevant provisions of the CRPD. Now, these two obligations, of course, are part of the positive obligations of states parties to effectively eliminate discrimination or discriminatory barriers faced by voters with disabilities when voting. In terms of the obligation to make reasonable accommodations, under Article 5, Paragraph 3 of the CRPD, this is a duty of states parties under this provision in the realization of all rights of persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. The CRPD committee, as you mentioned, I think in its general comments 2 and 6, has articulated relevant criteria as regards the obligation to provide reasonable accommodations. So, for example, the CRPD committee has described this obligation as an ex nunc duty. It has recalled that accommodations, of course, must be negotiated with persons with disabilities, and that the duty to accommodate, unlike the obligation to provide accessibility, exists only if an accommodation doesn't constitute an undue burden on the duty bidder. So generally speaking, this involves the duty to assess the reasonableness of the actual accommodation requested, and also to assess whether the individual accommodation is a disproportionate or an undue burden on an entity. And in that regard, again, in its review of individual communications and concluding observations, the CRPD committee has consistently expressed that the decision to provide an accommodation in each case rests on an underlying proportionality test, right? And the proportionality test, well, seeks to balance the rights of and benefits and burdens and benefits to persons with disabilities and duty bearers. Now, the implementation of the obligation to provide, to make reasonable accommodations doesn't restrict the right of persons with disabilities to use, for example, accessible voting materials. And again, the CRPD committee has elaborated on the ratio legis of the obligation to provide accessibility. And the committee has indicated that the obligation to provide accessibility, among other things, is related to groups of people, corresponds to an ex-ante duty, and it is a proactive one. This means, again, among other things, that accessible voting materials, for example, must be provided before receiving the individual request in that an individual request in that regard. Also, the CRPD committee has explained how the duty to provide accessibility, unlike the duty to accommodate, is an unconditional obligation of the state's parties. This means that duty bearers may not excuse the omission to provide accessibility of the voting environment by referring to the burden of providing accessibility, right? Now, this is a hybrid, there is a hybrid nature of Article 9 CRPD addressing accessibility. This means that, as framed by the drafters of the CRPD, as I explained in Chapter 3, this is an economic, social, and cultural right with elements of civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression and freedom of movement even. Now, this is as such, providing accessibility in the voting environment is a progressively realizable duty. And the elaborations regarding the concept of progressive realization by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the context of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights have been taken into account by the CRPD committee and in its own elaborations on this topic. So the CRPD committee has, for example, indicated that the progressively realizable nature of, for example, the obligation to provide accessibility requires states to take initial deliberate, right? We know concrete and targeted steps towards meeting the obligation fully. And of course, the states have discretion in determining which steps to adopt. England has discretion, Spain has discretion, Cambodia, Colombia, they have discretion in determining which steps to adopt. Now, the thing is that steps must be effective in terms of achieving outcomes consistent with the obligations of the CRPD. And more importantly, these steps must be taken within a reasonably short time after the CRPD enters into force. This means, in my opinion, that when examining, for example, individual communications pertaining to the unconditional and progressively realizable obligation to provide accessibility of the voting environment, the CRPD committee should consider the reasonableness, right, of the steps taken by the state party in question. And
thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Hagen. Professor Hagen is Emeritus Professor of Jurisprudence at our university, and he's also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, let me start complimenting you with the beautiful book you have made. Beautiful, not only in the sense that the physical copy is a pleasure to work with, but also, and even more, in the sense that you made an effort to use empirical research in your inquiries. Not many lawyers do that, even though empirical findings are essential for creating good law. However, it is no easy task to combine doctrinal legal research and empirical investigations into a coherent story. And I have 3 related questions about the way you attempted to do so. I will mention the 3 questions after a brief introduction. A good starting point is your introduction to Chapter 5. There you formulate 3 sub-questions of your research. First, to what extent do England and Spain comply with the international obligations set out in the CRPD? And second, what are the experiences of voters with disabilities and other key stakeholders from England and Spain in using electoral-assistive devices? And 3, to what extent do those experiences influence the decision to vote by persons with disabilities? The first question is a traditional legal question. Answering it requires 3 steps. Determine on the basis of interpretation what international obligations do England and Spain have, and which derive from the relevant international human rights instruments. The second step is to determine what the relevant behavior of England and Spain was. And third, compare the behavior to the obligations. I will not go into any more details with respect to this first question. The question fits in your main research questions, which read, under international law, what legal obligations do state parties have to make electoral-assistive devices available for use by persons with disabilities, and how do practices within electoral systems in England and Spain support or constrain the use of electoral-assistive devices? The second and third question may have very interesting answers, but asking and answering them is not an obvious affair in a legal study, as opposed to, for instance, a social psychological or a sociological study. Moreover, it is not immediately clear how they relate to your main research questions. And this brings me to the questions. First, why is it important for law what the experiences of disabled voters with the use of electoral-assistive devices are? Is it part of the legal obligations of states to guarantee a particular kind of experiences? And second, why is it relevant how experiences of voters with a disability influence their decision whether or not to vote? Isn't the issue whether they can vote and not whether they actually decide to do so? More in general, combining empirical and legal doctrinal research in a single study is prone to raise the question of how the two relate. For a legal dissertation, it should be clear how the answers to the empirical questions are relevant for the legal research. And that brings me to the third question. Can you explain why the empirical questions you answer in your thesis are relevant for legal research? Thank you very much.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your kind words and for your question. Well, I want to start my answer by saying that, and maybe you agree with me on this, there is an increasing demand for researchers in the field of human rights in general to carry out interdisciplinary research and even applying or using mixed design in the work. And this is a reality that we are facing, in my opinion, right now, and that it is likely to be the case in the future. So the whole idea of the research, the bigger research project that I was working in, the DARE, Disability Advocacy Research in Europe, was to use, among other things, the voice of persons with disabilities in our research, right? It was important right from the whole purpose of the whole project to consider and take in that way persons with disabilities, even in also their organizations, even as active partners in the research process. So when I drafted in finally, well, defined my research questions, I addressed this challenge of conducting or using legal and empirical research, because I am part, of course, of the Faculty of Law, and that was again the whole idea right from the beginning. Now, in the introduction to my research, I explained how it was important for me to define a clear concept of law that inspire a theoretical framework, which finally guided the research method that I employ in my work. I am talking about the use of the concept of the realistic concept of law that inspired the new legal realism as a theoretical framework that just guided the whole planning, exploring, and collection process of the data, of the research data. So based on these three main pillars, I was able to answer my research questions pertaining to the obligations of the states parties, and also to mainly to understand how the law is implemented in practice. And by that, I mean to identify what are the gaps between how the CRPD, for example, it was originally conceived and drafted, and as such, what is the legal obligation of this, in particular England and Spain, but how effectively they are implementing and complying with these with their obligations pertaining to the right to vote of persons with disabilities. And doing that was important because I had the opportunity to provide the most accurate picture, possible picture of how Article 29A CRPD is acting, let's say, or is implemented on the ground. And it wouldn't be possible for me to, in my opinion, to provide such an accurate picture without asking to original sources. By that I mean persons with disabilities and election officials, because they are also relevant actors in the context of voting rights, and on providing electoral-assistive devices to be used by persons with disabilities. So by doing the semi-structured interviews with research participants, I was able to understand that yes, what effectively, for example, what national legislation provides in terms of the right to vote is true. Let's say what is defined by the law, the written doctrinal materials is, well, it's a reality, it exists, legislation is a resource, what policy initiatives are in place, but when they elaborated on their experiences, on their voting experiences, it was possible for them and for me to realize what is happening on the ground. Even that in the two—
very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Campoy. Dr. Campoy is senior lecturer at the University Carlos III in Madrid and also a member of the assessment committee. And I would like to welcome him very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Rector, Professor Jan Smits. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking you for inviting me to be a member of this doctoral thesis tribunal, which I share with such illustrious colleagues. And if you will allow me, I will thank especially to Professor Lisa Waddington, whom I had the good fortune to meet some years ago, and who for me, as for so many others, is an essential reference in the field of the rights of persons with disability. And I am also grateful for this invitation because it gave me the opportunity to read an excellent doctoral thesis, a reading that was not only very pleasant to do, but also allowed me to learn a lot about the right to vote for persons with disability, especially about the great existence variety of electoral assistive devices and what is the situation in England. So thank you for allow me to learn about that. It is an excellent thesis. It formulates clear theoretical and normative basic principles, carrying out through an exhaustive analysis of the obligation of the state's party of the CRPD to put effective measures such as the use of electoral-assistive devices to guarantee the exercise of the right to vote freely and on equal condition with others. To do this, the author, Adriana Caballero, makes an analysis with a methodology that combines legal theoretical and conceptual analysis with a sociological methodology, all of which allows the author to make a substantial contribution to the academic debate, leading to new points of view and very valuable recommendations and conclusions, both in theoretical and practical spheres, to the exercise of the right to vote by persons with disabilities. I would like thus to start by sincerely congratulating the PhD student and her supervisors, Professor Linda Waddington and Mark Priestley, and her co-supervisor, Marcus Meyer, as well as the University of Maastricht itself for the magnificent work done with this PhD thesis. And I will also like to congratulate the candidate for her excellent presentation, which demonstrates not only her mastery of the subject matter, but also her confidence and clarity in the exposition of the different aspects dealt with in the thesis. As I said before, the main subject of the thesis is an analysis of the use of electoral-assistive devices in the exercise of the right to vote by persons with disability. Guaranteeing the exercise of the right to vote to persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others is, of course, an act of justice and a legal obligation under Article 29. But it is also necessary to ensure better democracy in our societies. In this sense, it could be understood that a better democracy is achieved not only for the incorporation of a good number of people traditionally excluded from the democratic process, but also because such incorporation will entail necessary change in the legal framework and in public policies. And also because these same electoral assistive devices designed in principle for people with disabilities will be very useful in facilitating the exercise of the right to vote for many other people without disabilities. In this sense, my question will be to know your thoughts on how you see the possibility of incorporating the existence and use of these electoral assistive devices as an element to measure the democratic quality of countries. And could this, do you think that it could be applied, or how it could be applied better to the cases of England and Spain that you work in the thesis? Thank you.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your kind words. Es un honor conocerlo, Profesor Ignacio. Muchas gracias. Thank you for your question. I believe in technology as a space of possibilities, as it is framed by experts in the field of technology studies. So that's part of my belief, without saying that I am naive and that I do not recognize the potential adverse impacts on human rights from the use of technology or technological solutions, for example, in the context of our democracies. But I do think that, and this is what this is what my research proves and demonstrates, that the use of technology, and in particular assistive technology, is a measure, is a means of achieving greater accessibility in the voting environment. And with that said, I agree with you, not only persons with disabilities, but also other groups of people, and including, I would even say all voters may find certain electoral assistive devices useful for them to vote this includes someone like me, if I would have the right to vote in a non-Spanish country, for example, as a language learner, it would be useful for me to use an easy-to-read political party manifesto, or even an easy-to-read voter education guide. And I found in my research, particularly when doing the inventory of the available devices, that in different countries, as I said before, both within and outside Europe, as electoral-assisted devices are being used to assist other voters, not only persons with disabilities, in voting. So I think that this is a space of possibilities for all voters. I think that absolutely for the research is needed to confirm whether or not the availability of these devices has a relation with increasing numbers or increasing lower voter turnout in elections, and how effective the participation of users of these technologies is in practice, in our reality. So we need further research in that. What I found, and particularly this is the case of Spain, is that the users of the existing electoral-assisted devices, the accessible voting kit, and the tactile ballot guide, who are mainly blind voters who know Braille, regarded these devices as positive devices that enable them to participate in elections, to vote secretly and independently, as required by the CRPD. And more importantly, I think that it wouldn't be fair to say that research investment in production of other of new electoral-assisted devices is not necessary. It is, of course, necessary, mainly because only this group of research participants, the targeted users of the existing devices, could elaborate on how the use of technology enable them to participate in elections on an equal basis with others. This was not the case for the other research participants, because no other devices are available for them. There are no other technological aids that they can use to vote. Now, another aspect that I want to highlight to finish my answer is how important it is that we understand that it's not just about availability of voting technological solutions. It's also the duty of the states to ensure that these technologies are working and properly maintained. Because as also you mentioned, well, the case of England is that there are also existing devices that are meant to assist voters with disabilities. But unfortunately, what I found in my study, based on the voting experiences of research participants with disabilities, is that these devices are not working properly, right? So the results that the state is aimed to achieve by providing these devices are not consistent with the obligations of the CRPD. So again, I think this is a space of possibility. Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Eliza Varney, who is a senior lecturer in law at the School of Law of Kiel University. She is also a member of the assessment committee, and I also would like to welcome her very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you here, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Adriana, I really enjoyed reading your work. I think it was so well written and so meticulously researched. My question is about human dignity. So in your proposed regulatory framework, what role do you envisage for the concept of human dignity? Thank you.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your kind words and for your question. It's an honor to meet you. The whole progressive conceptual understanding of disability, as discussed by the drafters of this International Human Rights Treaty, is based on the recognition that at the core of legislation, policy initiatives, and other measures, the recognition and the respect of human dignity of persons with disabilities should exist. Even the whole concept of human dignity and as a principle is, well, it is a principle of the CRPD as established in Article 3 of this treaty. So of course, the whole idea of adopting as much as the quality measures that the states can do to respect the human dignity of voters, and by that I mean to enable persons with disabilities to vote in the way they want, is necessary and should exist. Now, when I say that the idea behind or underlying the use of voting technological solutions should be to enable persons with disabilities to vote in the way they want, I mean by that either by using the existing voting materials, not necessarily electoral-assistive devices, if that is the decision of voters with disabilities, and also, for example, being assisted or not in voting, if that's depending on what is the decision of the person with disability. So that's part of the whole recognition of the human dignity of voters with disabilities. And also something that it was very important for me to elaborate in my work is how necessary is that every single measure implemented, for example, the decision to design and implement electoral-assisted devices, is based on meaningful consultations with persons with disabilities. Again, behind the idea of closely and meaningful consulting with persons with disabilities is the principle, respecting the principle of human dignity. There is no, it is not acceptable that that after the adoption of the CRPD, there are still countries and, well, national authorities that are implementing measures, of course, with their best interests or with the whole idea to ensure the rights of all persons with disabilities without consulting them. Again, this just relies on the recognition of the human dignity of persons with disabilities. And that's something that also, as a researcher, was important for me. That's why I made the decision to carry out focus groups and individual interviews with persons with disabilities, more like based on the idea of taking them as active partners. Again, just, yeah. So thank you so much for this interesting question. Highly esteemed opponent.
You, Dr. Varney, are you satisfied with the answer?
Yes, very happy with the answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In that case, the opposition will be continued by Professor Sillen. Professor Sillen is Professor of Constitutional Law at our university. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, it was with great pleasure that I read your interesting book. It offers a very careful study, both legal and empirical, of the requirements of that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities imposes on states parties regarding the design of the electoral process. I therefore join in the congratulations already expressed by my colleagues. You have delivered an achievement to be proud of. I would like to ask you a question on what I, as a professor of constitutional law, find the most exciting issue, namely the extent to which parties to the treaty must enable persons with mental or intellectual disabilities to vote in general elections. It is undisputed that the convention also applies to persons with these disabilities. However, that does not mean that complying with the convention at this point is easy. After all, in these cases, there is a thin line between providing assistance and influencing voters. And that is why I would like your advice. In doing so, I would like to draw your attention to two aspects. First, in your book on page 55, you discuss reading aids as an electoral-assistive device for this category of persons. You indicate that there are several varieties of such reading aids. There are easy-to-read booklets on voting and the electoral process, but there are also booklets on, and I quote, political party manifestos and candidates to make an informed political choice. If I understand this correctly, these booklets offer a simplified version of the position of candidates and parties. That sounds sympathetic, but I also see problems there. Who produces those simplified versions? And if it is someone other than the political party or the candidate, to what extent can such a simplified version be neutral? In other words, to what extent is this electoral-assistive device compatible with the right to freely express political choices? And second, the Netherlands has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but has made an interpretive statement with regard to Article 29. According to that declaration, the Netherlands interprets the provision as meaning that all persons with disabilities are entitled to assistance in the polling station, but only persons with physical disabilities are also entitled to assistance in the polling booth. With this declaration, the Netherlands says it wants to ensure that the vote cast is actually the voters' vote. In your opinion, was this declaration necessary? In other words, does the convention also oblige states to allow assistance in the polling booth if the voter has a mental or intellectual disability? And if so, how does this relate to, again, the right to freely express political choices? I look forward to hearing your response.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question and for your kind words. Well, as I explained and as you said, actually, yes, the CRPD admits no exception regarding impairments to recognize the right to vote of persons with disabilities in elections, and as such to establishing the relevant legal obligations of states parties. Now, the whole issue of persons with mental and intellectual impairments has been comprehensively addressed by disability scholars working in the field, particularly of voting rights. Mainly this concerns research in the field of the de jure realization of the right to vote of persons with disabilities. This research explain are centered mainly on the statutory barriers to participation faced by persons with disabilities, including guardianship laws that bar persons with disabilities and mainly those with mental and intellectual impairments from voting. Now, what we must be clear on is that any discriminatory law, any discriminatory measure is prohibited against persons with disabilities is prohibited under the CRPD. Again, there is no exception regarding types of impairment when implementing measures to ensure the jure and de facto right to vote of persons with disabilities. This without saying that, of course, national electoral authorities don't face challenges in ensuring the right to vote of all persons with disabilities, including those with mental and intellectual impairments. There are, of course, challenges in this process, but these are not unsurmountable challenges. And what, for example, I have addressed in part of the recommendations that I included for national electoral authorities is providing training or voter education initiatives targeted at persons with disabilities. There are very good experiences and practices both from England and Spain addressing education of persons with mental and intellectual impairments in voting. This has been carried out and this has been led by disability organization of persons with disabilities, DPOs, in the country, and in some of these initiatives, national electoral authorities have also played a role, at least, for example, funding the initiatives. Also, something that was important for me to say and to highlight in my book is how Article 29A CRPD connects with several other provisions of the CRPD, including Article 8, which establishes the duty of states parties to implement, or it's related to awareness raising measures adopted by the states to, for example, promote respect for the right to vote and within even the private sphere, for example, in the context of family, and also addressing the obligations of the states parties under Article 4, addressing stigma and the stereotypes of regarding the capabilities of persons with disabilities to vote. Now, the use of easy-to-read voter education guides, easy-to-read political party manifestos, as I demonstrate in my work, and based on the voting experiences of persons with mental and intellectual impairments who took part in my study, is that these devices are useful and enable them to participate in elections. So yes, it's some of these devices were designed and implemented again by national electoral authorities and disability organizations, where persons with disabilities directly took active part in designing these devices. Now, in terms of the right to voting assistance, this right is not included in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It was provided as such by the CRPD.
We just
right?
heard the may not have been very clearly visible or audible, I should say, the hora est, but you may briefly conclude your reply.
Thank you, dear Prorector. I was saying that the right to voting assistance is not mandatory in the context of the CRPD. Voting assistance is a right of all persons with disabilities when voting. It must be provided at the request by the person of their own choice where necessary. And also, based on my study, something that I contribute to is in understanding that voting assistance goes beyond personal support and includes the use of voting technological solutions. So just to say that providing voting assistance or having access to voting assistance methods and means is a right of all persons with disabilities, and as such, providing voting assistance is an obligation of all states parties to the CRPD, but it doesn't mean that it's just it just relate to personal support, for example. It also includes the use of technological solutions, for example. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Dear candidates, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company online will await the results of our deliberations and our return in this online session.
Thank you, dear Prorector.
Adriana Caballero Pérez. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Waddington is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Adriana, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Adriana Caballero Pérez, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed with the official seal of the university, now shown by the beadle.
Thank you.
Adriana, it is a pleasure to be the first to congratulate you on receiving your doctorate. I say the first to congratulate you, but I know that you're in Colombia and it's 5:20 in the morning at the moment. Meanwhile, I'm in Melbourne and it's 8:20 in the evening here. So in the history of PhD defenses in Maastricht, I doubt there has ever been such a big time difference between a supervisor congratulating a new doctor and the new doctor receiving that. Congratulations. There is a 16-hour difference. Now you have always addressed me as Professor Lisa, and you have addressed Mark as Professor Mark, and Marcus as Dr. Marcus. So it is a pleasure for me to address you now as Dr. Adriana. Dr. Adriana, you joined us at Maastricht as part of the Marie Curie DARE Innovative Training Network, and DARE stands for Disability Advocacy Research in Europe. And 14 early stage researchers were employed on the project, which is coordinated by our good friends at the University of Galway and led by our good friend, Professor Eleanor Flynn. Now, you started with us in September 2019, and you are the first DARE early stage researcher to be awarded her PhD. Moreover, you are the first PhD researcher to be awarded their PhD this year by Maastricht University. Now, our colleague, Hanzu Liu, who is also a DARE early stage researcher at Maastricht University, will defend her PhD this year, as will many of the other researchers working on this project in Galway, Leeds, Iceland, Lucerne, Brussels, and Lisbon. Now, I know that you've enjoyed working with those early stage researchers who are part of the network, and that you have supported each other in the challenging times of COVID. Now, DARE had a wonderful program of joint trainings and internships and placements that were planned for all of you. We were going to have joint trainings in Galway, in Lisbon, in Leeds, and in Brussels. And you, Dr. Adriana, were going to have placements at Leeds University with Mark, and at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Washington, DC with Virginia Atkinson. Now, you were able to travel to Galway and Lisbon before COVID arrived, and then to Brussels for the final training event in May of last year. But in between, we had to organize remote training events. And both of your placements also had to be virtual and remote. And your planned trips to hold focus groups with persons with disabilities and observe elections in England and Spain also had to move online. Now, of course, this was a disappointment to all of us. But you, Dr. Adriana, you took all of this in your stride. You quickly organized online focus groups and interviews, and you have had meaningful and interesting placements with Mark in Leeds and Virginia at IFES, and those have allowed you to write papers for policymakers and make important presentations. And in the last few months, you have made a very important and helpful contribution to the faculty by teaching the course International Human Rights Law to our bachelor students. Now, I'm very pleased that in spite of COVID, you were still able to travel home to see your mother and your family in Colombia while you were working on your PhD. And you also spent a lot of time with your sister, who lives in Cologne, and together you managed to visit some lovely parts of the Netherlands. Now, I congratulate also your family on this important occasion. Now, during the pandemic, you also moved from Maastricht to Kerkrade, which is a town which is about 35 kilometers from Maastricht, very near the German border. And you moved to a brand new student hotel, which had a gym and other facilities. And I know, because you told me often, that you were very happy there. And during our Zoom meetings, I often saw your very pleasant studio or the big hall of the student hotel with the gym in the background. It looked fantastic. And unfortunately, I never got the chance to visit you there. Now, Dr. Adriana, you have worked extremely hard during your PhD trajectory, and you have finished quickly. And I saw and I commented on, I think, 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 versions of some of your chapters. And those chapters changed and improved immensely after their first iteration. But of course, after those first 6 months, our supervision meetings also had to move online. And then I sent you your papers with my written comments before each meeting. Now, I gave you a lot of feedback, and I was sometimes worried that that could be demotivating for you, because I was suggesting that you make lots of changes. And at the end of each meeting, as I always do, whether it's face-to-face or online, I ask you how you were feeling. And I stress that you've done a good job and you had the skills needed to make those papers better. And I need not have worried, because what you said to me was, Professor Lisa, I like to learn from you. That is why I'm here. I see that your suggestions will make the paper better, and that is what I want. Now, that extremely positive and open attitude has served you really well, and it has enabled you to achieve what you have achieved today. And it will serve you well in the future. Dr. Adriana, I wish you all the best for that future. I hope that we're going to stay in touch and that you will remember your time in Maastricht and Kerkrade in spite of COVID. I hope that you will remember that time with a great deal of affection. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lisa.
Dear Dr. Caballero Pérez, also on behalf of Maastricht University and our Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. I think that the good thing about defending your thesis at 4 o'clock in the morning is that you have the whole day left to celebrate, which is what you should really do together with your family and friends, whom I also congratulate from this position, acting as pro-rector in this session. Also, many congratulations to the supervisors. Many thanks to the members of the committee here present. Thank you so much for your questions and for your willingness to also bring this project to a good end. Congratulations again to our young doctor. And with this, I also officially end this academic ceremony.